Thank you, Michael. On June 22nd, 2012, I received a note from Dr. Soraya Dalil, the health minister of Afghanistan, asking me to help with a case of a 6-year-old girl named Marzia. During the intense fighting between the US Special Operations Forces and the Taliban insurgents, Marzia's car was ambushed by gunmen on the way home. She was found alive under the car seat, but had suffered a bullet wound to the head and had lost her father and brother. As I finished reading the note, all I imagined was her father's last words: "With change, be strong if I'm not around." I often relive the stories of the children of conflict and trauma that I've cared for in the past 20 years. Like Wad, who stepped on a landmine while he was playing with his friends. And Aisha, who had her nose and ears cut off as punishment by the Taliban. And then there's little Abdeen, who had half his face blown off by a car bomb injury in Baghdad. I always hear the parent's voice: "With change, be strong if I'm not around." I escorted my mom to prison for the first time since my father had been arrested. I was escorted down a long corridor by a prison guard, his fingers like 5 large cucumbers pressed against my wrist. He had me sit on a long, white, cold bench for what seemed like an eternity, my heart racing with a rhythmic chant of the ceiling fan that was above me. And then my dad finally walked in. His face was sunken, his hair ashen, and his voice was almost imperceptible. "Kaveh," he said, "our country is changing. I want you to be comfortable with change. Be strong for your mother if I'm not around." He went on to talk about our country, Iran, and how it was undergoing profound change, and how our family will not be the same. But I felt confused. His words vaporized as I felt helpless and abandoned. You see, all I wanted to hear was that everything would be the same, and that our parents would be around, and that I could go back playing with my friends again. Well, 3 years later, the reverberations of change had gone from a ripple in a pond to a tsunami. One uncle was in prison and tortured, while another uncle was assassinated. And my father, who had been released from prison, one day we had a knock on a door, and 2 detectives requested a meeting with him. Except this time, he was able to escape through the bathroom window into the narrow alleys of Tehran and over the mountains into Turkey, with 1 suitcase and the help of the Kurdish smugglers. My mother and I were able to reunite with him a few months later at a small motel in Taksim Square in Istanbul. And of course, by now, we'd become political refugees, looking for a new home, looking for peace and stability. I'm fortunate enough to have found that stability in the United States, where I'm now associate professor and chief of plastic and reconstructive surgery at New York Medical College. My passion has also led me to start a nonprofit organization called Mission Restore, where we seek desperate places to teach and train doctors. And that is exactly why we're here in Africa, because we want to take advantage of training and teaching doctors, since the disparity amongst trained physicians to the population is astronomical. As you can see in this slide, the area of focus currently is in Central and East Africa. By way of example, there's 1 trained surgeon in reconstructive surgery for every 10 million population in Tanzania, versus 1 for every 40,000 in the United States. So what do we do to create permanent change in these settings? Well, we recruit talented young doctors to train the next generation right here in Africa. They also teach them the essential surgical skills that are relevant to their own communities. The idea is operating with the local surgeons, not for the local surgeons. And what is it like to operate in a setting where there's basic resources? Well, we've learned 3 important lessons. 1, what drives the lack of adequate care is not the poverty of wealth, but the poverty of process. We can perform a perfect operation and teach that perfect operation to a surgeon. But if the nurses don't pick up the infection afterwards, well, it's still a failure, which is why we emphasize judgment over technology. 2, in order to scale our work, we need to place responsibility and an accountability on the communities that we serve. If we have a local surgeon with adequate and sustained support, that surgeon can perform about 10,000 operations in his career. And with over 100 surgeons currently in our network, that translates to over 1 million lives affected in a lifetime. And 3, in order to keep our project sustainable, we're training more women to become leaders in healthcare. What we've noticed is that women who have finished their training tend to stay in their own communities as primary caregivers, whereas men are likely to leave abroad for an economic opportunity and take their families with them. And that is why we pivoted towards educating more women to become leader trainers, with over 40% of our workforce currently being women. So I stand before you because of an invisible journey that started when I was a child in Tehran. The impact of the revolution made me relentless about pursuing places on the planet where there's conflict, war, and trauma. I deeply care about a child whose future is affected by an accident, or even worse, the possibility that that child may not be able to walk or write or talk again. And to my parents who never abandoned me, I still hear your words. I still want to be there, be strong, and help where I can, and help restore the lives of those who, like us once, felt confused, alone, and abandoned. In 1914, Mahatma Gandhi, who was living right here in South Africa at the time, wrote, "If we could change ourselves, the tendencies in the world will also change. So let us be the change that we want to see in the children, because there's nothing more powerful than the realization that a child can walk or write again. And there's nothing more meaningful than the satisfaction that a child can smile again." Thank you.